This is the Commander speaking, and I'm Eric. We're here to talk about some unconventional ways to build your Commander deck. Well, okay, I have to admit, today's deck is not very unconventional, but it is a ton of fun. We're playing with Kaldheim's Kardur Doomscourge, and we're not playing Rakdos Aristocrats, so leave your blood artists at home. We're going to be all about the combat step. Everyone's going to fight, and it'll be fun, I think. Kardur Doomscourge is a 4/3 Demon Berserker, and if I were an 8-year-old boy that loved lasers and sharks, then Demon Berserker would probably be my favorite creature type. And look at this card. It has lightning and fire and a big scary demon with a fiery maw and face tentacles. This is great. Anyways, Kardur has, when Kardur Doomscourge enters the battlefield, until your next turn, creatures your opponents control attack each combat if able, and attack a player other than you if able. And whenever an attacking creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So right away we can see that there's 2 general themes that we can build around with Kardur. First, we can focus on his enters the battlefield effect, which is almost, but not quite identical to Goad. It's actually slightly better than Goad, since Goad affects creatures that exist on the battlefield when the Goad effect happens, but Kardur's ETB ability will even affect creatures that enter the battlefield after that ETB effect resolves, but before your next turn, of course. Now, Kardur's second ability wants attacking creatures to die for some Aristocrats bonus, just like every other Rakdos deck. Now, I'm choosing to focus primarily on Kardur's first ability, that Goad-like effect that triggers when he enters the battlefield. And before we try to build a forced combat deck, we should compare Kardur to the other existing commanders for such a deck. First, there's Marisi, Breaker of the Coil. This is a Naya cat that has, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, goad each creature that player controls. Then there's Thantis, the Warweaver. This is a big Jund spider that has vigilance and reach, and it forces all creatures to attack each combat if able. And whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, Thantis gets a +1/+1 counter. So unlike Marisi, Kardur goads all creatures just by entering the battlefield. Marisi, on the other hand, wants you to fill your deck with a bunch of little evasive creatures in order to hit your opponents and goad them. Creatures that are, of course, fairly useless if you can't keep Marisi on the battlefield. Kardur requires no such investment, though he will require a different type of investment to continually trigger his enters the battlefield effect, unless you just love paying commander tax. Now, Thantis doesn't goad at all. He allows your opponents to attack you, but he gets really big when they do. He also forces your creatures to attack too, which neither Kardur nor Marisi do this. Thantis also costs 6 mana compared to 4 mana for Kardur or Marisi. So my argument here is that if you want to build a forced combat deck, Kardur is arguably the best option. His ability to pseudo-goad all creatures is the easiest to trigger, since it's just an enters the battlefield effect. Now, if we want to trigger this ability each turn, we would need to rely on blink effects, but we don't really have these in Rakdos colors. So instead, we'll rely on a few colorless blink effects, and we'll supplement with Black's strong access to sacrifice and graveyard recursion effects to repeatedly trigger Kardur's enter the battlefield effects. So I really want to focus on this first ability of Kardur's, this enter the battlefield effect. I don't want to build around making a bunch of creature tokens and attacking with them and then sacrificing them during combat to trigger Kardur's draining effect when an attacking creature dies. And the reason is that to take advantage of that second ability, Kardur needs to stick around on the battlefield, and that means we'll need to protect him. And I don't want to mess around with that. I'd rather let Kardur die if someone wants to kill him, and then recur him when I need him. So instead, we're going to build our own army of creatures that attack really well. So as long as everyone else is tapping all of their guys and punching at everyone that isn't us, we'll have our own haymakers to throw as well. Like I said, it'll be fun. So let's go over the deck strategy. And first, let's talk about our blink and recursion package. So we want to be able to trigger Kardur's enter the battlefield effect several times per game in order to keep our opponents punching at each other and away from us. We'll use a few blink effects that we have access to, mostly with artifacts, but we'll largely rely on graveyard recursion since we're in black and we have good access to those sorts of cards. Malakir Rebirth, Supernatural Stamina, Undying Evil, all of these can be cast in response to one of our creatures dying, and then these spells return that creature to the battlefield. Now these are single-use effects, but our opponents won't see them coming, and all of these spells only cost a single black mana. Of course, we'll also use more repeatable graveyard recursion in the form of Phyrexian Reclamation. This black enchantment costs 2 mana and lets us pay 1 and a black and 2 life to return a creature card from our graveyard to our hand, and we can do this as many times as we want. This is a good deal. As Felden of the Third Path. This creature lets us pay 2 and a red and tap him to create a token copy of any creature in our graveyard. We give that token haste, and it makes us sacrifice that token at the end of the turn. We'll often want Kardur to go to the graveyard when he dies instead of to the command zone so that we can recur him with things like Phyrexian Reclamation and Felden. We'll also use Mimic Vat. This has Imprint. Whenever a non-token creature dies, you may exile that card. If you do, return each other card exiled with Mimic Vat to its owner's graveyard. And then you can pay 3 and tap the Mimic Vat to create a token that's a copy of the imprinted card, the card exiled with Mimic Vat. That token copy gains haste, and you exile it at the beginning of the next end step. So the Mimic Vat can only exile one creature card at a time, and anytime a non-token creature dies, you can replace the creature card that's currently exiled with Mimic Vat with that creature that just died. And then you can make a copy of that exiled creature card each turn for just 3 mana and tapping the Mimic Vat. That said, I would not recommend exiling Kardur under Mimic Vat. If you do, and someone destroys your Mimic Vat, Kardur will be stuck in exile for the rest of the game. But we're running plenty of other creatures that would love to be copied with Mimic Vat, so it still has a place in this deck. And not to mention, of course, we can use it on our opponent's creatures as they die. Finally, we can use bounce effects to continually trigger Kardur's ETB effect, though at a higher mana cost since we'll need to recast him each time we do this. Erratic Portal, for example, is a 4-mana artifact that lets you pay 1 and tap it to return a creature to its owner's hand. And once you resolve Erratic Portal and get it onto the battlefield, you'll be able to protect pretty much any creature from most types of removal and trigger enter the battlefield effects again. And of course, you can bounce an opponent's creature too if they decide to tap out. But we can also bounce Kardur with Sanctum of Eternity. This is a land that lets you pay 2 and tap it to return your commander to your hand from the battlefield. You can only activate this ability during your turn. So this will only work for Kardur, but it basically lets you pay 7 mana each turn to be unattackable forever, or at least until all but one opponent is dead. And the great thing is this is a land. Sanctum of Eternity is kind of the MVP of this deck. I'm running Expedition Map mostly just to help us find Sanctum of Eternity. Now, since we're in reanimation colors rather than blink colors, we'll need some ways to sacrifice our creatures in order to be able to recur them. We'll run some of the classics like High Market and Viscera Seer, but I specifically want to mention Yahenni, Undying Partisan, and Immersturm Predator. Look, again, we want to sacrifice our creatures, but we're not playing an Aristocrats deck. We're playing a beat face deck. So the best thing for us is when our sacrifice outlets can also beat face. Viscera Seer cannot beat face. High Market cannot beat face. Yahenni is a 2/2 with haste that lets you sacrifice a creature to give them indestructible until end of turn, so they're hard to kill. And whenever an opponent's creature dies, Yahenni gets a +1/+1 counter. So Yahenni can indeed beat face. Immersturm Predator is a 3/3 vampire dragon with flying, and when it becomes tapped, you exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard, and you put a +1/+1 counter on Immersturm Predator. And you can sacrifice a creature to give Immersturm Predator indestructible until end of turn, and you tap an Immersturm Predator. So just like Yahenni, Immersturm Predator is hard to kill. And just like Yahenni, Immersturm Predator can get big and beat face. These two creatures are amazing in this deck. They are free, instant speed sack outlets, they're resistant to removal, and they could help us kill people in combat. I've really been impressed with Immersturm Predator specifically in this deck because it also has evasion and graveyard hate. But with all this talk about recursion and beating face, let's go over the other aggressors that we'll be playing in this deck. Now I like creatures that are good at attacking and also help my opponents attack each other more effectively. Now let's talk about Frontier Warmonger and Frenzied Saddlebrute. A Frontier Warmonger is a 4/4 that gives all creatures menace, including your opponent's creatures, as long as those creatures aren't attacking you or a planeswalker you control. And Frenzied Saddlebrute does the same, except with haste instead of menace. It's a 5/4 with haste that lets all creatures attack as though they had haste, as long, of course, as they aren't attacking you or a planeswalker you control. This is a lot of fun, by the way. Speaking of haste, I'm focusing heavily on haste in this deck, along with aggressive, attacky creatures to help pressure my opponent's life totals. So if we're making them throw their Wood Elves and Grand Abolishers at each other, but that's just not getting the job done, we'll still have the ability to do it ourselves with our own creatures. Ogre Battle Driver is a scary, scary thing to sit across the table from. This is a 4-mana 3/3 with a triggered ability that says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, that creature gets +2/+0 and gains haste until end of turn. Now Glorybringer has built-in haste. It's a 5-mana 4/4 dragon that can exert when it attacks. A creature that exerts won't untap during its controller's next untap step. And if you exert Glorybringer as it attacks, it deals 4 damage to target non-dragon creature an opponent controls. So it can clear flying blockers out of the way, and you can always sacrifice Glorybringer and then recur it to essentially untap it, rather than waiting 2 turns to use it again if you exerted it. We'll also use Crashing Drawbridge and Tuk Tuk Rubblefort to just give our creatures haste. But what sort of creatures are we trying to give haste to? First I want to mention the Encore creatures from Commander Legends. We're running Coastline Marauders, Elvish Dreadlord, and Rakshasa Debaser. So Encore allows us to exile these creatures from our graveyard and create a token copy of them with haste for each opponent, so typically that will be 3 token copies in a 4-player game. Each copy created for each opponent has to attack that opponent, and then we sacrifice those token copies at the end of the turn. Now Elvish Dreadlord is basically a board wipe. It gives all creatures -3/-3 until end of turn when it dies, all non-elf creatures. Or, generally it gives -9/-9 to all creatures when we encore it in a 4-player game, because we're making 3 token copies of it that all die at the end of the turn. And I really like Coastline Marauders. It's a 0/3 with trample, but it gets +X/+0 until end of turn when it attacks, where X is the number of lands defending player controls. So this guy really punishes that green ramp player. Now Rakshasa Debaser is kind of our flagship Encore creature. It's a 6/6, so it attacks well, and whenever it attacks we get to put a creature card from defending player's graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. So that's pretty cool, especially when we give it haste or encore it. But I'm also running these Encore creatures because if we Encore them with Kardur and a sacrifice outlet on the board, we can sacrifice the token copies during combat to drain our opponents. Like I said, we aren't running a token creature aristocrats package, but I'll make an exception for these Encore creatures because they also provide some utility for us, and they're not just sacrifice fodder. But the strongest creature in our deck, especially when it's got haste, is definitely Ilharg the Razeboar. This is a 5-mana 6/6 with trample, and that's already a pretty decent rate. And it has, whenever Ilharg the Razeboar attacks, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking, return that creature to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. Now Ilharg can trigger any of our ETB effects on a creature card in our hand just by attacking. And if we can give Ilharg haste, we can bump up our combat damage by a lot, out of nowhere, to catch our opponents off guard. Now, be aware that Ilharg isn't quite as awesome as we would like it to be, though, because it puts a creature card into play tapped and attacking. That creature won't get any attack triggers, like Rakshasa Debaser, for example, won't steal a creature from an opponent's graveyard if it's put into play with Ilharg's triggered ability. Glorybringer, for example, won't be able to exert to deal 4 damage to a creature as it attacks if you put it into play with Ilharg, because it was never declared as an attacker. So just be aware of that. So those are some of the most noteworthy combat-oriented creatures that we'll be using. But let's discuss some of the other synergies that are built into this deck. Now again, although we're not focusing on Kardur's second ability to drain our opponents when an attacking creature dies, we will use a few of the strongest cards that make more attackers and get them to die. A Genesis Chamber is a 2-mana artifact that has, whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, if Genesis Chamber is untapped, that creature's controller creates a 1/1 colorless mirror artifact creature token. So when our opponents play creatures, they get even more creatures, and we can force those 1/1s to attack. And if they die in combat while Kardur's on the battlefield, we drain the table. And if our opponents realize this and decide not to block them, well, then they're taking damage, and that's fine too. I also want to prioritize instant speed mass removal, because if an opponent happens to be attacking with a bunch of creatures, then wiping them all out at instant speed during the combat step after they've been declared as attackers will let us drain our opponents out of nowhere with Kardur. A Magma Quake is an instant that costs X and a red, and it deals X damage to each creature without flying and each planeswalker. There's Starstorm. This costs X red, and it also deals X damage to each creature at instant speed. And it doesn't matter if these effects kill Kardur, we'll still get the triggers for his life-draining ability to go onto the stack. We'll also use Vona's Hunger. This is an instant that costs 2 and a black, and it makes each opponent sacrifice a creature. But if we have the City's Blessing, that is if we have 10 or more permanents on the battlefield when the spell resolves, then each opponent instead sacrifices half of the creatures they control, rounded up. So again, this will help us wipe out a bunch of attackers at instant speed to drain the table for a bunch of life with Kardur. Now, Vona's Hunger won't kill as many creatures as a big Magma Quake or Starstorm most of the time, but it will get around indestructible creatures, and it won't hit our own battlefield at all. Now let's talk some more about Goad and Forced Combat. As long as we want to force our opponents to send their Grand Abolishers and other squishy utility creatures into enemy lines, we'll want some redundancy to help us force combat even when we can't get access to Kardur. A Bloodthirsty Blade is basically spot removal with upside. I mean, equipping this to an opponent's Blightsteel Colossus is usually way better than hitting it with a Swords to Plowshares or something. There's Fumiko the Lowblood, Geode Ranger, Warmonger Hellkite, and all of these help by being decent attackers that can also force the table into combat. Now, as long as we're goading the table, we might as well play Curse of Opulence. This is a red enchantment, a curse, and whenever the cursed player is attacked, we make a treasure. And so does the player attacking the cursed player, if it's not us. This enchantment is great ramp, and it only costs a single red mana. Now, as long as we're going to force all of our opponent's creatures to attack someone other than us, we might as well play with Monarch, because we can make it fairly difficult for our opponents to take Monarch away from us. Monarch is a mechanic that doesn't exist in the game until it's introduced by a card, and once it's in the game, it won't go away. Only one player can be the Monarch at a time, and the Monarch gets to draw an additional card at the beginning of their end step. But another player can steal the Monarch by dealing combat damage to the Monarch with a creature. Now, I've already made a deck tech for a couple of Monarch commanders, Jared and Marchesa, so check that video out for more details if you want to know more about the Monarch mechanic. With this deck, I'm not really building around Monarch, but I've included a couple of Monarch cards. The most notable one is Emberwild Captain. This guy is really cool. It's a 4/2 that costs 4 mana, and it makes you the Monarch when it enters the battlefield. But it also has, whenever an opponent attacks you while you're the Monarch, Emberwild Captain deals damage to that player equal to the number of cards in their hand. So I really like Emberwild Captain, because as your opponent's decks get stronger and stronger, they probably draw more and more cards. And so Emberwild Captain will make it harder and harder for them to attack you, because when they do, they'll take 1 damage for each card in their hand. And what's cool is that if you get down to a 1 versus 1 situation, if you can force your opponent to attack, either with Kardur or one of your other forced combat abilities, they'll have no choice but to attack you and take that damage from Emberwild Captain, if you're the Monarch, that is. And notice that this damage is dealt by an on-attack trigger, so it'll resolve before they even get to do combat damage. Now, it won't happen often, but this is a potential finisher in situations like that. Now, Kardur's pseudo-Goad can help weaken the table, but if it's down to us versus one remaining opponent, Goad won't protect us. Because under these conditions, we are still forcing creatures to attack, but they have to attack us, and Goad won't prevent them from attacking us. So, and again, in a 1 versus 1 situation, Goad doesn't do as much as we would like. So when this happens, we need to be able to either force through the remaining damage in combat or find alternative win conditions. Now, we already talked about a few cards that we can use to drain our opponents by killing attacking creatures when Kardur is on the battlefield, but we also have a couple of other non-combat win conditions in Terror of the Peaks and Warstorm Surge. Warstorm Surge is a 6-mana enchantment, and Terror of the Peaks is a 5-mana, 5/4 flying dragon. Both of these do the same thing for us. They have, whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. Well, specifically, I guess, for Terror of the Peaks, the Terror of the Peaks itself deals the damage, and for Warstorm Surge, the creature entering the battlefield deals the damage. So anyways, as we repeatedly recur our creatures from the graveyard, or with things like Mimic Vat, or Felled Another Third Path, or Erratic Portal, and so on, we can get tons of damage triggers from Terror of the Peaks and Warstorm Surge. And because we're playing with creatures that have decent power, like Clackbridge Troll, we can do a lot of damage. So these are some of the alternative win conditions we have outside of goading our opponents and forcing them to attack each other. And that's pretty much what this deck does. It's pretty simple in its strategy, but it's a lot of fun. Now, I'm not going over a lot of the card draw and mana ramp that's in the deck here, because a lot of it is pretty straightforward, but you can see the deck list in the description for more details. Now I'd like to move on to the deck stats and cost. Our Kardur Doomscourge deck has an average converted mana cost of 2.91. We have 36 lands and 32 creatures. There are 10 cards that either recur or blink creatures, or bounce them back to our hand. And we're running 6 sacrifice outlets. We have 6 cards that force creatures into combat, in addition to our commander, and 6 cards that grant our own creatures haste. We have 10 card draw spells and 10 ramp spells. And we're running 9 single target removal spells and 3 to 4 board wipes, depending on how you define some of the cards, like Vona's Hunger, which technically won't wipe out everything. At the time of this recording, the cost for this deck is $141.35 on TCG Player. Now, the most expensive card in this deck is Terror of the Peaks at $23, followed by Ilharg the Razeboar at $10. If you wanted to reduce the budget, you might try swapping these for some combination of Hellkite Courser. This card's about $5, and this guy's a lot of fun. Or you could also use Inferno Titan or Calculating Lich, which are both much more budget options. Now, all of these creatures really love to attack, and Calculating Lich specifically will drain the table out whenever your opponents are goaded into attacking each other, which is really great in this deck, obviously. We're also running Erratic Portal to help us reuse Kartur's Enter the Battlefield effect, but Erratic Portal is currently around $7, so you could try Palace Siege, for example, instead. Now, this enchantment lets you return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand at the beginning of each of your upkeeps, so you will likely need some sort of sacrifice outlet to continually recast Kardur with this, and that's why I like Erratic Portal a little bit better. We also have a couple of, a little bit more expensive mana ramp in the form of Curse of Opulence and Talisman of Indulgence, both of which are around $7 at this time. So, just if you're on a budget, you may find some ramp alternatives to these. I don't have any specific recommendations, but just pointing out that these are a couple of things you might want to substitute out if you want to decrease the deck's cost. So that is Kardur Doomscourge. I've gotten to play with this deck several times now, and even though it's not a terribly innovative deck, it is a ton of fun. Goad ends up being an arguably better version of Pillow Fort cards like Sphere of Safety or Propaganda, because in addition to keeping your opponents from hitting you, you force them to hit each other. And because we're building primarily around Kartur's Enter the Battlefield trigger, we don't have to worry about trying to keep our commander on the battlefield, like we would have to do if we wanted to use his aristocrat-style ability to drain our opponents when attacking creatures die. Now, as I've mentioned before, I really like deck builds that don't require you to protect your commander, either because that commander has built-in protection, or because it doesn't need to stay on the battlefield long for it to do its thing. I also really like decks that scale with the power level of my opponents. So this is cool because as our opponents play bigger and scarier and more aggressive creatures, our ability to damage the table by forcing our opponents to swing at each other, well, it also increases. That said, we definitely won't have as much influence in a game without big creatures. To be honest, this Kardur build won't do as well in those matchups, but we're also playing a lot of creatures that attack well, as well as alternative win conditions like Warstorm Surge, so we'll at least still have a chance to win even if our opponents don't play big creatures. But that's all I have for today. Please like this video or subscribe if you found any of this useful. I make commander-focused content showing you all sorts of unconventional ways that you can build your commander decks, from budget alternatives to deck techs to top 10 lists. And thank you for watching.